So we are here. We're back again, episode 3. Slater here, owner of Relentless Defender Apparel, and we're in the Ground Zero Media Studios. And this is episode 3 of Police Critical Incidents. We already talked about, of course, episode 1, episode 2. That was all about what happens during a critical incident, how a critical incident can occur. We gave you scenarios on it. And then we followed up with episode 2, which was what to expect immediately after a critical incident, what an officer should expect, and how the investigation kind of gets going, and what the officer is going to go through. Now, in many ways, I think episode 3 is probably the most important episode because it's the most impactful as far as the long-term aspect of what happens after a critical incident. And again, I'm joined by a great friend and awesome partner in this series, and it's Clint McNear from Texas Municipal Police Association, the field rep supervisor. And I don't think if you've been watching any of these, you don't need any other introduction than that. But really, what we're going to talk about today and get kind of his expertise, and we're going to kind of discuss it, is really the officer has now gone through this critical incident. And from the critical incident, he has now initiated an investigation. And now we really want to kind of move into what is going to happen from there, because there's a lot of things that happen ultimately with your family and with the department and the relationship with your coworkers. And there's a lot of understanding of when do you return to work and how do you return to work and what does that look like when you return to work. And then there's a psychological process that you go through. And then we're going to touch on a little bit about PTS, and I'll let him explain why it's not PTSD. And I love the way he categorizes that and explains that. And then things about staying off the internet and kind of what you need to do and what you need to look for. But ultimately, let me kick it off by saying this. You get into a critical incident, it's pretty much fair to say that your life has changed forever in one form or fashion, okay? And mainly, not because necessarily it's just going to be negative, but yes, now you have something that you've emotionally gone through, you're going to continue to emotionally gone through, you ultimately have done something and been involved in something that very, very rarely happens in law enforcement. So it does change your perspective on things or your experience level on things. And I always talk about the idea of life isn't measured by time, life is measured by events. So this is a very, very significant event that you go through. And that's what we want to talk about is really what can you expect and what's going to happen with that. But Clint, let me just get you on and let's start it out and really talk about the most important part, in my opinion, and really it should be in most people's opinion, but let's talk about family. You get into a shooting and you're under investigation, and the investigation is actually ongoing, but we're drawing out the investigation now because now it's waiting for grand jury and that type of thing. You're off duty because you're on administrative leave. Let's talk about how and how it ultimately, and you've seen it affect family.
Yeah, that's. I think you just nailed it in one line there. The most important aspect of all this is family. When the shooting's over, and we talked last episode about that day, the day of the incident. Now we're talking about, and that's not the easy part, but that's the quick part. You got 7 or 8 hours of events that day. That's going to be fast and furious. What we're talking about now is weeks, months, or years process that goes on after that. And we ended the last episode talking about going home and really looking inward to yourself and your family and having an understanding of what lies ahead with today's news cycle. Every police incident has the potential to be in the news. Having an understanding that every police incident has the potential to be in the news, you need to take steps to insulate and protect your family, but to not be so selfish that you think this only affects you. I can tell you story after story of incidents where a critical incident has affected someone's family. Either police officer shoots a bad guy and a few days later, police officers' kids come home and say all the kids at school are calling my daddy a murderer. And it turns out dead bad guys' kids go to school with the officers' kids. There was a scenario where officer was involved in a shooting and was having heat runs done by his house constantly, immediately after the shooting. Turns out dead bad guy's family lived about dead bad guy's parents lived about 4 doors down from the officer. So there's a lot of things that we don't think about. We only think about the shooting itself, pulling the trigger and surviving. We don't think about the long-term effects that it can have on our family. And the better you can have an understanding on the front end of what you're going to go through, the better that you prepare yourself to handle what you're going to go through, the better equipped you're going to be mentally, emotionally, physically to take care of your family and help navigate through that process, because it's going to affect everybody. It can, is going back to church, or people going to look at you differently depending on, maybe what your beliefs are, or there's so many things that can have a very direct impact on your family that you need to have understanding for, you need to have a preparation for. And we've talked about having a plan. Have a plan of how you're going to visit with your significant other about, hey, here's the deal. Moving forward, we need to be cautious as we move out in public. We need to consider where the bad guy lived, or does his kids go with our kids? There's so many things outside of just pulling a trigger or surviving a shooting that we really need to think about. And as you said right from the get-go, family's number one, and we need to really look inward and think about that.
Yeah, and of course, both of us been cops majority of our adult life, and we've either been a part of critical incidents, been involved in critical incidents ourselves, or have, in fact, family members that have been a part and good friends that have been involved in critical incidents. And I can tell you, one of the things that I think becomes a stressor is a lot of times they become very reserved from their family. They start to separate from the family and tend to shut down and almost kind of go into depression in the aspect of, taking in the scenario of husband being a police officer and you have a police officer wife, and he's just stops talking to her. And a lot of times I used to get information, or I used to get called from the wife and saying, I don't know what to do. He's not talking to me. He's reserved. And what would you give somebody advice in that aspect?
I would say find the balance that you have with your spouse. Probably every situation is going to be different, but it's kind of like we talk about with the media. I think you need to give them something. I've had guys tell me, man, I don't tell them anything. I'm protecting them. They don't need to know anything. Well, that may be very scary for her or him to not know anything. I'm not saying on the opposite end of that, you need to tell them every gory detail of where your rounds hit and, how, what happened during it and how close to death you came or whatever. But understand your spouse or your significant other and give them something, and find that balance of whatever that may be for both of you, because the stressors can compound quickly when the emotions are that high. And I think just putting a wall up and saying, well, I'm protecting you and I won't say anything, I don't think that's the right answer. Find some balance in there.
Okay. Let's talk about the department specifically. So ultimately the department is, you're going to be on administrative leave. And while the investigation's going on, or they may even bring you back for what they call like a light duty leave. I mean, a light duty change of your job to where you're not doing law enforcement or any kind of field activity. But a lot of times the department may treat you a little bit different. And let's talk about the idea of the leadership within the department, because there's times where an officer will be involved in a critical incident because the investigation's going on both criminally and the admin side of things is they may get treated different even by their police chief or by their sergeants, lieutenants, just the bar, stars, and stripes. Yeah. Talk about and this is really kind of understanding, but also give some advice to the people in leadership in the department.
Yeah, and one thing too, you mentioned administrative leave. One thing people see in the newspaper, and for the public that may be watching and not have an understanding of law enforcement, when you see an officer's on administrative leave, paid administrative leave is not an adverse action. A lot of people assume, I knew it was a bad shooting, that officer's on admin leave. Anytime you've been in a horrifically stressful gun battle, that officer's not going to report to duty in the morning at 8 a.m. and be right back to work. And so the public that may be watching this really know that an officer, when you read an officer is on paid administrative leave, there is not a air of suspicion or wrongdoing in that. There's many reasons for that. To the leaders of the department, take care of your people. You don't have to say you did a great job. I had a chief tell me one time, I had an officer that was really, really, really struggling with the shooting that he was involved in, and he told me, Clint, my chief won't even look at me. My chief won't say a word to me. He avoids eye contact like I've done something wrong. And when I went with the chief to ask him, hey, why can't you say he did a good job? Well, liability, what if it turns out it wasn't a good shooting? And I told him he did a good job. And I'm like, Jesus, how about, I'm glad you're okay. I'm glad you're safe. I'm glad you protected the public out there. There's 5,000 other things you can say other than you did a great job or whatever liability scares you to say. And I'm sure in his concern about liability, he wasn't giving any consideration for the mental aspect that played into not being able to look his officer in the eye. Mm-hmm. The first thing that officer needs to have an understanding is, I'm glad you're safe. I'm glad you made it through this, or I'm glad you protected those citizens by intervening, whatever. That's not saying you were justified. There's no liability in saying I'm glad you're okay. That's a pure human instinct that somebody would like to hear, rather than the leader of their organization that won't look them in the eye or make eye contact with them like they're a suspect.
And as far as the peer officers may not understand how to interact with an officer that was involved in a critical incident. A lot of times it's because they're saying, and they think, well, I can't talk to them because we're not allowed to talk about the incident. And a lot of times they don't know how to treat the officer, that they kind of become standoffish to the officer. And just take a moment and explain, one, that scenario and why that tends to be the case, but also how to combat that.
Yeah, it's unique. I buried a partner in 2008, held him in my lap when he passed. I was very tight to my folks when my daughter passed, and when I went back to work both times after those incidents, I felt a little bit alone on an island to some degree, because we're all kind of tough guys and we're not touchy-feely guys. And I've been there myself. But I had folks come up. My department was very good to me, don't get me wrong, both of those incidents. But occasionally I would see guys, or even guys I was close to, that wouldn't say anything. And I've asked some of them before, hey, man, and they're very blunt about, well, I didn't know what to say. And, after somebody's been in a horrific shooting or someone's partner was killed on duty or whatever, there's probably not a good thing to say. You don't ever want to go up and tell them, hey, I know how you feel. Unless you've walked in their exact shoes, don't tell them you know how they feel. But you can go up to them and tell them, hey, man, I'm glad you're okay. Call me if you need something. Call me if I can do something to support you. Love you, brother. Not saying anything, again, goes back to like the chief that wouldn't make eye contact. If you don't know what to say, find something. Don't not take their calls and click them to voicemail because you can't find some words to say. They've been in a bad predicament or a bad incident, so you can put yourself in one and choose some words to say to them, because that just builds on it. When you got a guy waiting on a grand jury to play out for several months, that's stressful. Mm-hmm. He walks down the hall, his chief won't make eye contact with him. That's stressful. The circle of guys that I work deep nights and shag calls with, they click me to voicemail when I call because they don't know what to say or they don't want to get touchy-feely. And you start giving the appearance, even though all of those may not be intentional, of the guys on an island. Find the words to say. Man, I'm glad you're safe. I'm glad I'm glad to be able to see you in the hall and be able to slap you on the back, brother.
Well, and if nothing else, a lot of times just being there to listen.
Yep.
And of course, they can't talk to you about the actual incident. They can talk to them. They can talk all day about how they feel, or maybe what they're going through, and sometimes, like you said, there is no right words, and it's just one of those things where you sit there and say, "Hey, brother, I'll tell you right now, if you need anything, 3:00 in the morning, call me. I'll just sit there and listen."
We're all alphas, but when you do that right there and say, "Hey, man, how you making it?" You may be surprised sometimes how you feel, or even some of those alpha tough folks, when given the opportunity to unload on a trusted person, what they're struggling with or what they're going through.
Absolutely. So, and part of returning to work, again, this is kind of backtracking a little bit, but when you decide to, or when they decide you're going to return to work, so ultimately you initially get put on administrative leave, and before you end up returning to work, there's a few things that most agencies will require you to do. And some of that, and one of the process is a psych test. The problem with the psych test is a lot of times, and I'll let you to describe it, but what does that psych test actually look like for the department?
Yeah, that you need to have understanding. You're going to have to requal. You're going to get a new weapon until yours is released from evidence. You're going to have to requal, and you're going to have to get cleared from a psych. I would suspect 99% of departments in Texas, you're going to have to get cleared from a psych. But again, we've talked about have a real understanding, be realistic of what the real deal going on is. That is not to determine if you really feel good, and that is for the department to say that they sent you there and they checked a box. We sent Slater. They said Slater's okay. Slater's back at work. That process, and I don't mean it to sound quite as jaded as it is, but we're just being real about it. That process is clearly for liability purposes, and to say that they sent you, you passed, and he's back to work. I've not met anybody that has found that opportunity fruitful to help them navigate an issue or a concern or a struggle that they're going through. I've been twice, and it was about 4 questions, and I was out of there. I could have done that with my 13-year-old.
Yeah, it's when we talk about liability, it's more of the liability aspect, and that's we're talking real. And don't expect that psychological meeting or the meeting with the psychologist is going to be anything that's going to, like you said, produce any kind of fruit and be fruitful for your well-being. It really is the understanding that the department says that you are sane, that you can return back to work, and that you're not going to be a liability on the department. With that being said, there is other avenues that every officer typically has, and if they don't, they need to look for if they're going through any kind of emotional or mental struggle. And again, let's just be clear on this. Just because an officer is involved in a critical incident, every single officer takes those critical incidents completely different from one another.
Absolutely.
And I've seen officers that are involved in a critical incident, and they go through hell and back emotionally, and to the point where that it causes a true understanding of PTS, and I'll let you explain PTS. And then there's officers that it happens, and it may not affect them as much as it affected somebody else, or it may not even affect them as much as this incident may happen from another incident that may seem like it's different. It's all about what they saw, what they observed, and how they interpreted it, and how they ultimately process that. But none of it is a sign of weakness, and I think that's where we fail looking from the outside in, as we sit there and say, because an officer is going through these emotions and these issues, call them issues, and I don't like calling them issues, but it's because they're going through these emotions, doesn't make them weak by any means. In fact, to try to reach out and get help is a sign of strength.
Absolutely.
And I think a lot of times law enforcement fails at that, because we look at it and say, well, Well, that's a sign of weakness whenever an officer is going through this. But if you can touch on this just for a second. First, let's identify why and what is, in your terms, PTS without the D. So explain why we say that and why you say that.
PTS, everybody knows, is post-traumatic stress. I leave the D off because there's not a person I know who wants to have a disorder, including me. I don't have a disorder, I'll tell you right now. I call it PTS when we're out talking with people. The culture of law enforcement, you mentioned when you return to work, the old 3 days, you'll be off 3 days and go to work, and guys, you say, well, I need to get back on the horse. I need to go back immediately. That was usually never good. And I tell folks now, take your time. And departments have an understanding that 3 days is not hard and fast. It's different for everyone. The better you take care of yourself on the front end, well, the better you have knowledge of all the topics we've discussed, you have a plan in place, the better you have mentally and emotionally prepared to have a plan for that, you're going to minimize some of the effects of going through this because it's not going to be as scary. Once you've gone through it, if you proactively take some steps to ensure your well-being, to ensure your family is emotionally safe and secure, you reach out to clergy or to a counselor, you reach out to somebody you trust, peer to peer, find a good place to be. The faster you do that, your long-term prognosis is exponentially better. The old guys that, well, I got in a shooting, I'll go back to work tomorrow, and I'll just start knocking off a bottle of Tito's every night, and I don't need any of that. Those are the guys that we see that are the 30-year officers that are alcoholics, that have been through 17 divorces, that have financial issues, call in sick every time they accrue 8 hours, and struggle to stay on the job. And I'm not faulting those guys because our culture has failed them, and I'm part of that culture. I've been around it 22, 23 years. I'm a part of the culture that has failed, and I'm one of the guys that 22 years ago, I would have told you I don't need anything. I'm tough. I don't need to talk to anybody. Our culture has to do better, and it all starts with getting the stigma off the PTS, taking care of one another, and being willing to communicate about that. But the 3-day admin leave, you need to find out what's best for you, and that may be 4 days, that may be 5 days. You need to go back out and requal so you hear gunfire, figure out what's going to go on after that. But you need to do what's best for you. I had a shooting in a rural town, and the officer called me a couple of days later. He'd gone on a family disturbance, knocks on the door, suspect answers the door, shoots him point blank with a shotgun. He has bird shot all in his shoulder of his offhand. I get on the phone with him the night it happens. He's not a TMPA member. Somebody just called and said the guy was struggling, so I called him that night. We talked for a minute. He's like, no, I'm good. My offhand's numb, but I'm good. He's at a pretty small department. Well, about 2 days later, he calls me, leaves me a very urgent voicemail. So I called him back. So what's going on? My department is calling. I said, man, that's cool. They're calling to check on you. No, they called and told me I need to get my ass back to work. They're shorthanded. I'm like, whoa. Didn't you say you got shot 2 nights ago? Yeah, but they said I'm shorthanded and get my ass back to work. I'm like, is your offhand working? Well, no, it's completely numb. But they told me that's fine to go back to work. I said, but they didn't call to check on you. He goes, nope. I said, let me ask you, and he goes, I guess I'm going to go back, sir. I don't want to get fired. I said, how are you going to engage the suspect in a fight if you only have one hand, if you don't have your offhand? How are you going to hold your weapon? How are you going to, well, I don't know. I hadn't thought about that, but I'm going to go back. You talking about eating our own and failing one another is you got a guy that almost lost his life. He was struggling very bad before the department damaged him. He struggled mightily after that. And I challenge leadership. Again, we talked about leaders. You don't have to have a title to be a leader. There's deep nights guys that have never taken a promotional exam, been on the same beat for 20 years. Those are the leaders. If you're a leader in a department and the chief won't reach out to these guys or won't lead, find these guys and take care of them, because the more we can address it and help them on the front end, the long term they're better.
The another aspect that I want to jump on is the internet, because we kind of live in the world of everybody has an opinion. everybody is an investigator. Everybody is an expert. Everybody knows
Facebook
better.
lawyer.
Exactly. And it become, the keyboard warriors. And what I typically see, and I think you could probably talk on this, is officers that are involved in critical incidents. No matter where you look, there's going to be a news story about it. No matter where you look locally, there's going to be some social media talk about it. And there's going to be arguments from people that weren't there. There's going to be arguments for the officer. There's going to be arguments against the officer. Neither one of them have any clue about what really happened. And but negativity seems to always be the thriving force behind constant interaction when it comes down to social media. So you take a news story, and when they put a news story up, everybody gets to be able to comment on those news stories on social media, along with just other Facebook posts and Instagram posts and whatever other posts you're going to do. What would you advise a police officer that is involved in a critical incident to do when he sees and reads and kind of starts to embed himself into what all of this confusion is going on? Or would you even advise him to even do anything?
So the last episode we talked about unpublishing your social media. Long term, stay off the internet. And I wouldn't even, I think you said advise, I would beg you, if you're involved in a critical incident, it doesn't have to be high profile. If it's a car chase that results in a wreck and a fatality or death in custody, or stay off the internet. There are people out there, trolls, that intentionally want to harm you with words. They don't care. They probably didn't read the article. They want to say something inflammatory to destroy somebody. And there is nothing fruitful that will come for your mental and emotional well-being from reading blogs, reading local news articles where they have the opportunity at the bottom to comment at the bottom. Local politics in my hometown. There's a person that they like to get on there and just spew hate nonstop. There's nothing constructive. There's nothing fruitful. They spew hate on there all day, and it keeps everybody stirred up. And if you're involved in one of these incidents, there's nothing for you and your spouse, and if your kids are older, there's nothing beneficial will come from your family from reading those. I would strongly encourage everybody to, again, turn internally, go camping, find what helps your family, Bible study or whatever internally is healthy for your family to grow, but not the internet, because there will be zero growth or anything positive gleaned from the internet on that.
Well, and again, if you start reading it, or even your family starts reading some of that stuff, none of those people know who you are. None of those people have any clue. And to try to get on there and comment back and try to argue back and try to convince an idiot, because that's what they are, they're idiots,
sure.
Okay? Try to convince an idiot that they have no idea what they're talking about is completely a waste of time, because their whole world is to watch others' worlds burn down. And we already know we live in a society where when it comes down to it, that police in general are the biggest target in social media right now, the biggest target for the media period right now. And no matter what we say, no matter what we do, no matter how much we explain the true facts don't really matter, because it's all about how do we put out false information out there as much as possible just to watch police officers squirm, or just to get under police officers' skin. And I love the idea that you said, just go camping, because the best way to do it is get your family and go and get away and kind of try to just relax the mind, relax the soul, relax the body, and just say, hey, you know what? If it's an emergency, call me. but I'm gonna be with my family for a couple days.
And the last thing you want to do when you engage a moron, you may do yourself more harm than good. You can't be rational with irrational people. So if you attempt to engage them and you end up losing your cool or getting mad and typing something, you don't want to give someone in grand jury, see, this officer has a temper problem. This is a post he made cussing these people out and raging on the internet and blah, blah, blah. I had an officer involved in shooting a while back. He's like, hey, man, my family had a trip to go camp and they're gonna be devastated about it. And I'm like, no, they're not, brother, because that's where you're headed. As soon as the attorney says you get cut loose from here, brother, that's going to be the best thing y'all can do is load up and head to the mountains.
No, I think that's awesome advice. The Clint, we're going to wrap this segment up because what we're going to do is I want to speak more to you about PTS on a separate episode, and in fact I want to bring in a panel of people to talk about PTS, because one of the things that in law enforcement we're seeing a lot more of is we're seeing the suicide rate in law enforcement, not just because of PTS, but of course other factors in that, but the suicide rate skyrocket right now. So one of the things that the followers and the supporters have asked for is to talk specifically about the suicide rate in law enforcement and how do we reduce that and what are some of the factors in that. But I want to get you back on and talk about the suicide rate and PTS and kind of, get your opinion on a lot of that as well. The anything else that you believe needs to go out as far as the follow-up? Will they ever be able to get back to a normal life? Let me ask you that.
It's a new normal. Everybody I've talked to that's been in a shooting, even a couple of critical incidents I've been involved in that I've not shot someone, but the critical incidents I've been involved with directly, there's a new normal, but it's like after COVID, everybody's asked, is there a new normal? We adjust, we're resilient, we move on. Having a plan in place now helps this aftermath process. Dealing with the aftermath directly, not putting it off, not drinking it out, not doing all of that, that helps all of the long-term prognosis. Being direct, take care of all of it. And we'll talk about, I'm sure, during some of the PTS episodes that we do about culture change that's slowly evolving. The military's pretty far ahead of us on it's okay to say I'm broken. It's okay to not be okay. We still have chiefs that think if I come forward and say, hey, I was involved in that shooting and it's bothering me, or I was involved in that shooting and I'm drinking a little bit, that PTS is like terminal cancer, which means your badge is gone and your badge and gun is gone and you're out of here because you're a liability. See you, get out of my building. And we have to do better. And I think the more we have a plan, the more directly that we take care of ourselves and our family afterwards. We've built a system in place to help us survive the rough spots.
In short, would you say, yeah, there is life after this?
Absolutely.
As long as we are educated in knowing what to do, our environment is educated in knowing what to do, and really the leadership mentors that.
Yeah, and everybody is affected. I've had people ask me, well, how do you think that guy handled being in that shooting? Well, who am I to address how that? I've had 22-year-old kids, brand new rookies, get in a shooting, and they're like, well, the guy pulled a gun on me, and it was me or him, and I didn't want to die, so I had to shoot him. You'd think it'd affect somebody like that. I've had hardened combat veterans who've been deployed, been in combat, been in direct action over and over and over, come home, get in a police shooting, and it sends them off field. And you would think somebody like that's built to understand and be able to get through a process. And it affects all of us different, depending on time and place and where we're at in our family. And so you can't say, well, how do you think Slater handled the shooting? I can't. I'm not going to tell Slater how he should handle that. I hope he tells me so I can be there for him, but I can't tell you how you should. And we expect everybody to be robots and go home, take your uniform off, get in the closet, and have no emotion. And we're humans. We hire from the human race. We're flawed, and we see things we're not built to see and shouldn't see, and we have to do better in our culture.
Absolutely. Well, guys, Clint, I want to thank you for coming on.
Thank you.
It's always a pleasure. This kind of wraps up our 3 episode about critical incidents, and whenever it comes down to the initial, the middle, and the end of understanding of where we're at with critical incidents. If you have questions, if you continue to have questions, comment on this post, to comment on the video. We will get back with you. In fact, if you have serious questions, ask us or DM us, and we will talk to you behind the scenes, not out in the open, in the comments.
24/7.
And I know Clint will answer anything that you guys have. I'll answer you anything you guys have. And if we don't have the answer, I can promise you we will get you the resources and find the right person to get you hooked up with. Again, guys, couple of major points above all else is you are not an island. You have resources, you have friends, and even the people that sometimes you least expect, and I've always found this in life, that sometimes the people that you least expect to be there for you tend to be there for you. And sometimes the people that you most expect to be there for you are the last people that will be there for you. And that's the reality of things, but you just need to open up and understand that. And also know that none of this is weakness. We're all human. We all deal with different instances, different ways. And like Clint had just mentioned, he talked about a 22-year-old compared to a hardened veteran. But I've seen officers get involved in 2 or 3 different shootings, and the first 2, they didn't bother them. It was the third critical incident that may have bothered them. And it may not even been a shooting, but it somehow, some way, that one bothered them even more. And a lot of times it's because of location per location, time per time, event per event. We all process it completely different. And I've seen officers that have seen everything and anything in the world, but again, that they may be involved and see a child die. And that's a very significant incident for them. And they take it a lot different than seeing an adult die, or vice versa, whatever the case may be. But the bottom line, guys, is you're not an island. And I want everybody to know that, and know that a lot of times we all tend to think, oh, I'm the only person that's going through this. Well, that's not the case. A lot of this is natural. A lot of this is the natural process that every single one of the officers that are involved in critical incidents go through. So know that you're not alone. Know that we will be here at any given moment. And then again, I reiterate, if we don't have the answer, we'll find you an answer. Clint, thank you very, very much.
Honor to be on, man.
And guys, as I always say, stay relentless. God bless. Stay safe.